Good morning. Welcome to Grace Bible Church. I find myself again in the unenviable position of your being able to see me and mine not being able to see you. But that's the way things are right now. We look forward, Bev and I do, to seeing you again soon when we're able to come back to and assemble together again. This week and next, we'll be closing out our study of Ecclesiastes. Now, if you would, I ask you to go ahead and turn your Bible there to Ecclesiastes chapter 11. I've said this before, but I'll say it again. The latter chapters of Ecclesiastes are at least more positive in tone than some of the earlier ones, but even they are not all positive. And what we said at the very beginning of our study is true even now, that Solomon's not being overly optimistic or overly pessimistic throughout his work. He's actually being biblically realistic, not shying away from looking at the hard and difficult issues of life, at the many incongruities and inequalities of life under the sun, at looking at the effects of the curse, in essence, especially the great equalizer of death. And through that, too, he's encouraged us to enjoy life with numerous enjoyment refrains. There is a method to Solomon's madness. He's led us through the depths of the difficulties of this life under the sun in order that he can best advise us and even entice us on how to best deal with life and these difficulties. Chapters 11 and 12 work to close Solomon's argument to that end. We're going to break them up because it's a little too much material for us to cover at one sitting, but chapters 11 and 12 are really one unit in the book. And when you're reading through the book of Ecclesiastes, I would encourage you just to ignore the chapter break at chapter 12 and read them together. Of course, it's absolutely essential that as you do that, you understand the argument that he's made through the first 10 chapters. And at the same time, I think these last two chapters shed light on what he's done on the first two. It's not completely clear as you're going through the first 10 chapters, he's doing what he's doing. But chapters 11 and 12 help you see that, just as the end of a book often helps you see what was developing in the plot. Solomon's not an advocate of either hopelessness or hedonism. Rather, he's encouraging us to joy, to obedience, to godliness in this life in light of coming judgment. That's a good summary statement of what the purpose of Ecclesiastes is. Let me give you another summary of the content in chapter 11. In Ecclesiastes 11, 1 through 10, Koheleth is concluding his message by using principles of sound investment to illustrate the approach we should take in all of our activity under the sun. Life is full of uncertainties, and the tool of wisdom is not fail-safe. We've seen that over and over in Solomon's work. But we must move ahead in our activity, or in Solomon's language, we must invest our portion. Not only because enjoying life gets tougher with age, and the debilitating effects of the curse, but also because our accountability before God gives relevance to all of our activity. Remember, that was a question that Solomon's asking at the very beginning of the book, and this is tending toward the conclusion, the answer to that question. Let's read Ecclesiastes 11, 1 through 10. Cast your bread on the surface of the waters, for you will find it after many days. Divide your portion to 7 or even to 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. If the clouds are full, they pour out rain upon the earth, and whether a tree falls toward the south, toward the north, wherever the tree falls, there it lies. He who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. Just as you do not know the path of the wind, and how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. Sow your seed in the morning. Do not be idle in the evening, for you do not know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed, or whether both of them alike will be good. The light is pleasant, and it's good for the eyes to see the sun. Indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all, and let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. Everything that is to come will be futility. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood, and follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. So remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. Now we're going to divide up chapter 11 into two major sections. First, invest your portion even though it is a risky world, in verses 1 through 6. And secondly, rejoice and remember, in verses 7 through 10. So let's look at the first section. Invest your portion even though it is a risky world. And under that, invest your life boldly, for you can expect a return. Verse 1 says, cast your bread on the surface of the waters, for you will find it after many days. Now this is obviously another proverb. We know that Solomon was a collector and lover of proverbs. Clearly in the context here, he's not talking about throwing water out on a lake and feeding ducks. He's not talking about casting your water into the waves, or casting your bread into the waves of the ocean to see if it will come back to you. It's a metaphor. It's a picture of foreign financial investment, something with which Solomon himself was quite familiar. He's hinted at this even at the opening verses of his work. In chapter 1, verse 3, he said, what advantage or profit is another way that we translated that word. Does man have in all his activity which he does under the sun? This idea of foreign investment is one that Solomon had great familiarity with. I mean, this guy had incredible resources and incredible opportunities as king of Israel, both to trade internationally and to develop international and diplomatic relations with other countries to the benefit of his own country. Of course, 1 Kings is the Bible book that tells us the most about this. We talked about this before, but it's worth reviewing. The story begins with Solomon having this opportunity to ask whatever he would of the Lord. And here's what he said, 1 Kings 3:9. Give thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of thine? Of course, this is right after Solomon was to become king. And he not only asked for a great thing in asking for wisdom, but he also asked for it with the right motivation. He knew that he would need wisdom to lead God's people. God was so pleased with that request that he not only granted him wisdom, but he granted him the things that he didn't ask for: riches and honor, and ability that gave him a reputation of being far greater than all the other kings that existed during his time. 1 Kings 4:20 says that during the reign of Solomon, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand that's on the seashore in abundance. You can hear echoes of the Abrahamic covenant in those words. They were eating and drinking and rejoicing. Now Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. They brought him not only wealth and sense of silver and gold, but all kinds of material goods from their various lands. 1 Kings 9, verse 26, the writer speaks of Solomon's fleet of ships for his commercial enterprises. That passage says, King Solomon also built a fleet of ships in Ezion Geber, which is near Eloth, on the shore of the Red Sea, in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent his servants with the fleet. Remember, Hiram was the king of Tyre. He's the one that helped supply Solomon with the timber for the building of the temple. And now he evidently also was in the commercial shipping with Solomon. Hiram sent his servants with the fleet sailors who knew the sea, along with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir and took 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. So these were pictures of the great reach of Solomon's kingdom, the great opportunities he had, even on the oceans, to trade internationally. Solomon's wisdom and prosperity gained him such an international reputation that the Queen of Sheba, who was no slouch as a royal ruler herself, came to see him, to pay him a visit. 1 Kings 10:4. When the Queen of Sheba perceived all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his servants, the attendance of his waiters and their attire, his cupbearers, and his stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. It took her breath away. Then she said to the king, It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. Nevertheless, I did not believe the reports until I came and my eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard. How blessed are your men! How blessed are these your servants, who stand before you continually and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, to set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness. Again, her reaction to this is because of the great blessing that God had poured out on Solomon. Later in the same chapter, the writer goes on to describe Solomon's prosperity in even more detail. 1 Kings 10, verse 21. And all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None was of silver. It was not considered valuable in the days of Solomon. That doesn't mean that they didn't use silver at all, because the next verses say that they did. But the idea here is that it was such a great time of prosperity that commodity like silver that would normally be incredibly valuable was seen as not so valuable. For the king had at sea the ships of Tarshish with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years the ships of Tarshish came bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. So King Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And all the earth was seeking the presence of Solomon. You talk about an international reputation. He had it. To hear his wisdom which God had put in his heart. And they brought every man his gift, articles of silver and gold, garments, weapons, spices, horses and mules, so much year by year. So clearly, Solomon knew what it was to invest and to prosper, even on an international scale. But when Solomon says here, cast your bread upon the waters, he's talking about more than just a financial investment strategy. That's certainly one application of what he's saying, but there's more to it than that. He's saying, in effect, invest the portion that God has given you in this life through maximizing the gifts and abilities that God has given you and the opportunities that he has given you to make use of those gifts and abilities. You know, that's different for each one of us. We're all wired a little differently. We all are born into different families, different countries. If you're thinking worldwide, there's different opportunities for each one of us. But Solomon is exhorting us to take advantage of those and maximize those. Don't let the difficulties and uncertainties of this life cause you to throw your hands up and give up. At the same time, and again, we see this kind of balance throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, don't throw caution to the wind. Life under the sun is a risky business. And Solomon encourages us to distribute that risk broadly. That's what his point is in verse 2. Divide your portion to 7 or even to 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. Again, this sounds more like something that our financial counselor would say to us rather than counsel on how to live life. But Solomon is talking about more than money. He's exhorting us to invest and diversify all of our activity, everything that we do under the sun. Just as with money, you have a better chance of a good outcome if you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And you certainly have a better chance of a good outcome by diversifying as opposed to not investing your portion at all. When you think about it, there's a parable in Jesus' ministry that affirms this idea. The parable of the talents. He taught on at least 2 occasions, in Luke 19 and Matthew 25. The one in Matthew 25 is part of the Olivet Discourse. Remember that discourse took place during the week leading up to the crucifixion of Christ. He's taking his disciples up on the Mount of Olives, and he's teaching them about his second coming. He's also teaching them in particular detail on how to conduct themselves, how to live between the 2 comings. Let's look at this parable briefly. I want you to think about the correspondence between what we've just read in Ecclesiastes 11 and the teaching of this parable in Matthew 25. Be on the alert then, for you do not know the day or the hour. Of course, he's talking about the day or the hour of his return. For it's just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and has trusted his possessions to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, talent here not in the sense of ability like I was talking about before, but in the sense of money. Talent was a unit of currency, of money. He gave to one 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. That's, of course, God's sovereign choice as to how he distributes those talents. And he went on his journey. Immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received the 1 talent went away and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. He did not invest his portion. Now after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. And the one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you've entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. The one also who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted to me 2 talents. See, I've gained 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one who had received the 1 talent, let me try that again. And the one also who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. So he did give him back what is his, but he didn't invest it. He didn't make anything off of it. His master answered and said to him, You wicked, lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I scattered no seed? Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would receive my money back with interest. Therefore take away the talent from him, and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has shall more be given, and he shall have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Cast out that worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there shall be weeping, gnashing of teeth. The idea of this parable is strikingly similar to what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. Invest or steward what God has given you as a portion, recognizing that it all comes from him, and that one day you'll have to stand before him and give an account of how you use what he's entrusted to you. At the same time, we have to be mindful that even when we are committed to this kind of investing of our portion, we must use wisdom and diversify to mitigate the risk, particularly because of what we do not know. Now, I'm curious, as you've read through the book of Ecclesiastes, how often have you noticed this phrase of what you do not know? It's something that's repeated on a number of occasions. Ecclesiastes 9:1, I've taken all this to my heart and explain it that righteous men, wise men, and their deeds are in the hand of God. Man does not know whether it will be love or hatred. Anything awaits him. Of course, that's a verse that we can affirm in the present circumstances that we find ourselves in. Then later in chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, I again saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, and the battle is not to the warriors, and neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to the discerning, nor favor to men of ability. Now, that doesn't seem quite right. It seems like that's exactly the way things are in general, but Solomon's not looking at it in general. He's saying even though those things often work that way, time and chance overtake them all. Moreover, man does not know his time. Like fish caught in a treacherous net and birds trapped in a snare, so the sons of men are ensnared in the evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. So man does not know, and that presents certain dangers to him, even if he's well prepared. Then 4 times in the first 6 verses of chapter 11, once we just read in verse 2, twice more we'll see in verse 5, and then once more in verse 6 again, this idea of we do not know. We'll look at those in verses 5 and 6 as we get to them. Now, having made the point of acting carefully in light of what we do not know, Solomon is going to expound on that idea in verses 3 through 6. He's going to consider the varying scenarios. First, the knowable factors. Ecclesiastes 11, verse 3. If the clouds are full, They pour out rain upon the earth, and whether a tree falls toward the south or toward the north, wherever the tree falls, there it lies. These are what we might consider natural laws or natural phenomena that are very regular. When we see clouds, dark clouds brewing on the horizon, and we see them moving towards us, there's a very good chance that we're going to get wet. At the same time, if we see a tree leaning and that tree ends up falling, it's going to fall in the direction in which it was leaning. And certainly when we see a tree on the ground that has already fallen, we can say that's where that tree fell. It's not going to fall anywhere else. In the same way, there are things in life that we can look at and have a pretty good idea of what the outcome is going to be. That's really what sages and practitioners of wisdom did. They looked at the patterns of life that produced good outcomes, and they sought to discover those patterns, to live by them, and to teach them to others. That's really what Solomon is doing here as well. However, even when dealing with things that are knowable in this sense and that have somewhat of a predictable outcome, you can't always know for sure. And you can't wait until you know for sure before you act. That's the point of verse 4. He who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. Now, this is the idea of, oh, the wind looks pretty bad out there. I'm not going to sow. My seed might get blown away. I would lose that. I don't think it's a good idea. Or looking at the clouds and thinking, oh, it looks like it's going to rain today. I probably better not work. I might get wet. Now, the balance is somewhere in the middle. Certainly, it's wise to consider the circumstances no matter what you're doing, and to take that into account as you proceed. But the flip side is that you don't get analysis by paralysis. You don't get paralysis by analysis, I should say. And you don't have to have everything lined up perfectly and know how everything's going to turn out before you act. It certainly does no good to daydream and not do anything. The responsibility to work belongs to us, and God will be the one to bless and bring the results as he sees fit. So, verses 3 and 4 give us the knowable factors. Let's look now at the unknowable factors in verse 5. Just as you do not know the path of the wind and how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God, who makes all things. Now, this idea of not knowing the activity of God, not fully understanding it, has been a recurrent theme in Ecclesiastes as well. God has his plan. He knows all things. He knows how all things work together in that plan, and we don't. Let's look at some of these occurrences previously in the book. Chapter 3, verse 10. I've seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He's also set eternity in their heart. The idea there being that man knows that there's been an existence before he came on the scene, and he knows that there will be an existence after he passes off through death. There's time that we are a part of, that we're kind of in the middle of. It's continuum. He set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. We can't find out partially because we live for a very short period of time within this huge time span of history. Then verses 14 and 15, chapter 3. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There's nothing to add to it. There's nothing to take away from it. That's the way that God's activity works. For God has so worked that men should fear him. That which is has been already, and that which will be has already been, particularly in the mind of God, for God seeks what has passed by. And then in chapter 7, verse 13, consider the work of God. Who is able to straighten what he has been? Now we can work hard to try to straighten what God has been, but we won't be able to. We won't be able to do something greater than what God has done. The resultant counsel is, in the day of prosperity, be happy. But in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not discover anything that would be after him. And finally, in chapter 8, verse 16, when I gave my heart to know wisdom and to see the task which has been done on the earth, even though one should never sleep day or night. The idea there being of a very exhaustive research. I saw every work of God. I concluded that man cannot discover the work which has been done in the sun, even though man should seek laboriously. He will not discover, and though the wise man should say, I know, he cannot discover. You can't fully comprehend the activity and plan of God. That's what 11:5 is saying as well. You do not know the activity of God who makes all things. Now, certainly there are things about God's activity that we do know, right? Things that are plainly revealed in His Word. We know what God has done in creating the world. We know that what He has done in bringing the curse that came about as a result of Adam and Eve's fall into sin. We know the consequences that have resulted from that fall, both from the Scripture, it teaches us about those consequences, and from our own life, our own experience. We know what God is doing in redeeming both creation and His people from the curse. And we even know what's going to come in the future to some degree, in broad outline. We know that Christ is going to return to the earth, that when He does, He'll bring a rule of peace and righteousness like the world has never seen before, and as the prophets describe in the Old Testament. He'll ultimately bring in a new heavens and new earth that's absolutely free from the curse and from sin. These are all things that God has made known to us through divine revelation in His Word, and we can rejoice in that. But as we've said, and as we say again now, we don't know the way God knows. There's an awful lot that we don't know at all, and this is by God's design. He's done it this way in order that men might fear Him and trust Him despite their ignorance. Deuteronomy 29:29 says it this way: the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our sons forever. Even though certain actions of God are mysterious and unforeseeable, we can't let that keep us from living life and investing the portion that God has given to us. Now, verse 6 sums up this section by giving us a good example of timing and wise sowing. Sow your seed in the morning, and do not be idle in the evening, for you do not know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed, or whether both of them alike will be good. In other words, work, be diligent, be thorough. Don't look at the circumstances and say, well, I'm not going to do that, that's too risky. Work hard, finish the job. If you have the option of working both in the morning and the evening, and you're not sure about one of them, do them both. Here's the way Walt Kaiser says it. Since we cannot comprehend the totality of God's providential acts, the only proper course of action is to be diligent and wholeheartedly involved. Some of this activity will succeed, even if all of it does not. It sounds very similar to what Solomon himself said back in chapter 9, verse 10. Whatever your hand finds to do, verily, do it with all your might. For there is no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol where you're going. Let's look now at the second major section of chapter 11, Rejoice and Remember, from verses 7 through 10. Again, this is a section that will begin this week and continue into next week. From here to the end of chapter 11 really deals with this idea of rejoice, and then chapter 12 is going to deal with the idea of remember. We start out with another proverb in verse 7. The light is pleasant, and it's good for the eyes to see the sun. Now, as much as Solomon has bemoaned life under the sun, and as much as he has looked at and examined and critiqued the various difficulties of life under the sun, he still encourages us to see life as a good thing and something to be enjoyed, despite all of its limitations. Certainly, life is better than death. That's a point that he made earlier back in chapter 9. It's better to be a live dog than a dead lion. And that's the same thing that he's saying here. Enjoying life is especially important when you're young. And Solomon's about to make that case. Much of what he says in the rest of chapter 11 is directed towards younger people, and the need for them especially to enjoy life while they're young, because it's going to get harder as you get older. That's just the way life is. That's the nature of the curse. We see this in our general experience, don't we? Generally speaking, our lives are the most carefree and perhaps the most enjoyable as young children. We're as carefree as we will ever be, with fewer responsibilities than any other time in our lives. Now, this is often true even into our teen years, at least into the early teens. But enjoying life can start to get a little bit harder then, just because of puberty and things that you're dealing with as you transition from childhood into becoming an adult. Then we hit our 20s and we have new pressures in life, pressures that we've not had before up to this point. We move out of the house and get a full-time job to support ourselves. We marry and we deal with that new relationship. We have children, and all of these are good things in and of themselves, but they're things we've not done before, and they bring certain pressures and certain new opportunities to kind of figure out how these things work. Marriage and children, well, when we get into our 30s, this can level out a bit, and we can start to kind of figure out how to do these things and how to do them well. Marriage and children can be a great source of joy to us, especially when we're being obedient to what the Scripture says in those relationships. We grow in wisdom in our 30s, and especially if we have a vocation that we've used wisdom to pick. We've kind of looked hard at the way that God has gifted us and picked a vocation that we're good at and that we can enjoy. We can have tremendous satisfaction from that. We continue to live our lives, and somewhere along the way, our kids get older. They start to leave the home for college or for marriage and making a home for themselves. We start to sense how fast life goes by. I've been thinking about this a lot myself personally. I enjoy, and I think this is kind of a natural thing, as you get older, you start to look back over your life more. You start to just think about different times, different things that have happened in the course of your life. It should be a cause of great thanksgiving for us as believers, just the things that God has brought us through, the various experiences that we've had, the various blessings that He's bestowed upon us. But I'll be 60 years old this year, and there's times where I think, I don't feel like I'm 60 years old, and I think, boy, how did it go by so fast? I start to think about the fact that the biggest part of my life, time-wise, has already passed. I don't mean that in a morbid way. I just mean that the average lifespan is somewhere between 75 and 80 years old. And even if you go beyond that, at best, at 60 years old, you're probably looking at 30 or 35 years of time left. Now, Solomon's going to start dealing with this in the verses that follow, tease those out in the remainder of chapter 11 and into chapter 12. So let's look at these nutshell admonitions in verse 8. Indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. Everything that is to come will be futility. So the two key phrases there, let him rejoice, especially in the length of days that God provides, and let him remember that life's going to get harder as you get older. That's just the way things are. You can see it yourself as you experience this life. You can see it or hear it in the instruction of Solomon here. So we'll do the let him rejoice part this week as we get to the end of chapter 11. We'll look in more detail in the let him remember part of chapter 12 next week. First, let's consider the tension between enjoyment and judgment. This is in verse 9. Verse 9, the first part of the verse says, Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood. Follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. He's saying, look, there is a lot of joy when you're young. Take advantage of that. Embrace it. Enjoy the opportunities that God gives to you. He's going to make the point that that's going to get harder as you get older, so take full advantage of it while you can. But he quickly follows that up with a warning. Verse 9, the last part says, Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. Now, some would argue that Solomon's being sarcastic here. He's saying, yeah, go ahead, sow your wild oats while you're young. Live it up as much as you want to. But you better remember that God's going to judge you for these things. I don't think that's the point that Solomon's making, primarily because as you consider all the other joy refrains that we've looked at in the book of Ecclesiastes, they're always sincere, positive exhortations. His admonition has consistently been to enjoy life under the sun as a gift from God, seeing all that he provides as coming from him, and all that we go through and experience in our lives as filtered through his hands. And you think back to chapter 3 and all the appointed times that God has made for us to go through. Even joy itself is a gift to us. I don't think Solomon is being sarcastic here in these verses in chapter 11. But he is reminding us not to let our enjoyment, particularly as young people, cross the line into sin. It is that reminder of our standing before God in judgment at the end of our lives that keeps the line where it should be. Now, verse 10 returns to Solomon's earlier thought. He speaks of both the inner man and the outer man here. First, the inner man, he says, put away vexation from your heart. That is, control your attitude. Don't let things rob you of your joy or crush your heart. You're certainly going to run into things that will attempt to do that, but you have to set your own perspective. You have to do that in light of God's truth. And you have to, as Paul would say, rejoice always. Recognize that even the difficulties of your life are for God's purposes, to conform you to the image of Christ. Make up your mind to rejoice in the Lord and to enjoy life as his good gift. Secondly, put away pain from your body. This one's a little more difficult, but I think the thing that makes the most sense because of the context is in the same way that you set your mind and attitude to enjoy life, take care of your physical body. Probably in the sense of just eating properly, exercising. Certainly that's going to have an impact on your quality of life. Seeing a doctor when you need to, not letting the ongoing pain or medical issues dominate your perspective and again rob you of your joy. Enjoy life as a gift from God, especially during the early parts of your life, because they won't last. Now, that may seem like a strange motivation. Enjoy life early because you're not going to enjoy it as much as you get older. I think that's exactly what Solomon's saying here. That is the reality. It's just going to become harder as you get older. Maybe it's not right to say that you won't enjoy it, but recognize that because of the curse, things are going to become more difficult. Take advantage of childhood and the prime of life while you can, because they're fleeting. Not only do they not last, but they give way to old age, and it becomes harder to enjoy life because of physical infirmities. Now that is what Solomon is going to detail in chapter 12. The key word there will be remember. Rejoice was the key word in the last part of 11. Remember in chapter 12. And that's what we'll pick up next week. We'll close out our study of Ecclesiastes next week in chapter 12. And let's bow now for a word of prayer to close our time together. Father, we are grateful and thankful for the book of Ecclesiastes. There's so much wisdom in this book, so much taking us back to your creation, to the fall, to the consequences of the fall, so much insight into the curse that resulted from the fall and into the way life is now, lives under the sun. On the one hand, Solomon doesn't back away from looking at the difficulties of this life. On the other hand, he encourages us to rejoice despite those difficulties. And yet at the same time, he warns us of coming judgment. And that prompts us to maximize the gifts and opportunities that you've given us, to rejoice always, even as we go through the difficulties of this life, and to remember our Creator in the days of our youth. Lord, help us to do that as a church body. We are various members of the body at different stages of life, and you have, by your design, given each one of us abilities and talents. Help us to maximize those, as Solomon talks about here in Ecclesiastes 11, and help us to do everything that we do as unto you and as honoring to you, to rejoice in that, and to recognize that one day we'll have to stand before you and give an account. Lord, We want to be faithful now so that we might hear you say, well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master. Thank you for our time this morning, we pray. In Christ's name, amen. So grace to you. Next week, you'll see me again. I won't be able to see you, but we'll enjoy our time together in Ecclesiastes chapter 12.